So let's get started. First of all, thank you all for making it on this nice evening. We were just talking in the back about the New York problem. One of the New York problems is that we're always competing against other interesting events. And I know 3 really good events that you're not attending by coming and being with us tonight. So thank you very much for that. I want to get us started. You know, there is a convergence that happens when you have people from Latin America, people from the South, leftists, elected officials. You know, nothing is going to start on time, but we're going to do our best. So thank you very much for coming out this evening to this event on People Cities. My name is Jean Paulo. I direct the Urban Democracy Lab here at the Gallatin School. Some of you know, we are in the midst, or about to start, Smart Cities here in New York City. And we thought we would take advantage of some of the people who were coming through town and advantage of some of our networks to invite some other very prominent people to talk about what cities can do for us, but from a slightly different perspective. So we toyed with calling it Smart Alex Cities, but we went with People Cities instead. So tonight we're going to have a very, very interesting conversation. We're very lucky to have this group of people with us. And we're going to talk about the possibilities and limits of cities and city-based activism and what urban democracy can and cannot do, even though we wish it would do for us. So before that, let me say a couple of thank yous. So in the back, Angelina De Socio and her staff, Victor Bautista doing videography, Kate Hayden from the Urban Democracy Lab, who was so instrumental in the logistics today, Becky Amato, who is probably still doing logistics as we speak, and the rest of the Gallatin staff. I want to especially thank Dean Suzanne Wofford, the NYU Collaborative on Global Urbanism, in the Department of Metropolitan Studies for connections and for additional funding. The Deutsches Haus here at NYU provided some generous funding as well, and the DAD in addition to that. And let me introduce my colleague, Sophie Gonick, Director of Metropolitan Studies, who will say a few words and introduce our speakers tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Gianpaolo, and thank you, Becky, too, for all of your help. So since coming to NYU 3 years ago, I've had the great privilege of being able to engage in conversations that extend, I think, far beyond the academy. Both the Urban Democracy Lab that Gianpaolo directs and the Global Urban Collaborative that I work with Tom Segru on seek to contribute meaningfully to and benefit and learn from conversations around housing, urbanism, and radical transformation, both here in New York, but also throughout the United States and indeed the globe. Tonight's event very much reflects an urge to explore the productive intersections of the academy, activism, and policymaking in exciting and possibly innovative ways. To that end, this event tonight also serves as somewhat of a teaser for the upcoming Fearless Cities North America Regional Summit. Following last year's inaugural Fearless Cities in Barcelona, where I had the pleasure of being with Kelly Acuno and Gerardo Pissarello and numerous others, Cooperation Jackson in Mississippi and Movement Net Lab here in New York decided to convene an event dedicated to municipalism and radical urban democracy. And I'm delighted that NYU will host that summit here in July from the 27th through the 29th. We are currently soliciting proposals through mid-May for panels, workshops, and networking events via the website fearlesscities.nyc. At that link, you can also sign up for the mailing list to be kept kind of in the loop. And at a later date, we'll also be able to, you'll be able to register for the event as a participant there. And I hope you'll all consider participating in various capacities. So with that event in mind, I'd like to now turn to tonight's exciting program. And I'm very excited to welcome this eclectic group of distinguished guests to NYC. And to that end, they're very distinguished. They have very long bios that I'm going to try to race through so that we can then hear from them. So, first up, Carlina Rivera represents the 2nd Council District here in New York City, which includes the diverse neighborhoods of East Village, Flatiron, Gramercy Park, Rose Hill, Kips Bay, Murray Hill, and the Lower East Side. She was elected to office in 2017 with 83% of the vote, and has established herself as a leader on many issues, including affordability, preservation, open space, resiliency, education, equality, and small business survival. During this legislative term, she was appointed chair of the Committee on Hospitals and elected co-chair of the city's Women's Caucus. In the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, she helped coordinate a 4,000-person volunteer effort to assist over 10,000 home-out residents. And she went on to help establish a Lower East Side disaster recovery network, which was instrumental in the response to the 2nd Avenue explosion, and today is a model for community-based urban planning. Next, we have Gerardo Pizarello Prados, who is currently First Deputy Mayor of Barcelona City Council and is responsible for economy and labor, digital city, and international relations. He is also in charge of international relations and global justice, historical memory, and technology and digital innovation. You have quite a lot on your plate there. He's also president of Barcelona Activa, the municipal local development agency, the Municipal Institute of Finance, as well as the Municipal Institute of Informatics. He was born in Argentina in 1970, but has lived in Barcelona since 2001. And he's also a tenured professor of constitutional law at the University of Barcelona. Margaret Mayer is Professor Emeritus of Comparative and North American Politics at Free University Berlin, where she began teaching in 1990. Her research focuses on comparative politics, urban and social politics, and social movements. She has published widely on aspects of contemporary urban politics, urban welfare state restructuring, and social movements. She co-authored Nonprofits and the Transformation of Employment Policies, co-edited Urban Movements in a Globalizing World, Cities for People, Not for Profit, and Neoliberal Urbanism and Its Contestations. She's currently completing a monograph on urban social movements and the state, and has served as an editorial board member of the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. Next, we have Callie Acuno, who is a co-founder and co-director of Cooperation Jackson. He served as the Director of Special Projects and External Funding in the mayoral administration of the late Chokwe Lumumba of Jackson, Mississippi. His focus in this role was supporting cooperative development, the introduction of eco-friendly and carbon reduction methods of operation, and the promotion of human rights and international relations for the city. Callie also served as the co-director of the U.S. Human Rights Network, the executive director of the People's Hurricane Relief Fund, based in New Orleans, Louisiana, after Hurricane Katrina, and he was co-founder of the School of Social Justice and Community Development, a public school serving the academic needs of low-income African American and Latino communities in Oakland, California. Our conversation tonight will be moderated by Juan Gonzalez, who is an award-winning broadcast journalist and investigative reporter. A two-time winner of the George Polk Award, he is a co-host of Democracy Now!, author of Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America, and a founder of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. His most recent book is Reclaiming Gotham, Bill de Blasio and the Movement to End America's Tale of Two Cities. He spent 29 years as a columnist for the New York Daily News, and his research interests include journalism, mass media history, federal mass communications policy, history of Latinos in the United States, Puerto Rico and U.S. relations, immigration, race and labor relations, and the role of dissident movements in promoting social change. He is currently Richard D. Hefner Professor of Communications and Public Policy at Rutgers University. And without further ado, I turn it over to our wonderful panel of distinguished guests. Thank you.
Well, thank you and good evening to everyone, and thanks to the folks here at NYU for sponsoring this important panel. I was actually on a smaller panel a little more than a year ago with the Deputy Mayor of Barcelona, Geraldo Pisarello. So this is like a return to see what's happened with the progressive and popular movements across the urban world, not just in the United States, but in the advanced capitalist world as well. I'm going to engage in a conversation with folks here to throw them out a few questions, let them expand where they want to go, and we'll go back and forth for a while, and then we'll throw it out to some questions from the audience as well. I want to begin with Callie Acuno, because I think when I was writing Reclaiming Gotham and looking at the various social movements that have developed in recent years and captured control of major cities across the country, the most astounding to me was that an avowed African-American revolutionary would capture the seat of the mayoralty in Jackson, Mississippi. Arguably, this is the capital of the historically most racist state in our union. And yet here you had a Marxist and a revolutionary managing to cobble together an amazing alliance to win the mayoralty. And I wanted to ask you how that happened. What is the Jackson Kush plan that so few people across the rest of America know about?
Okay, how did that happen? Persistence, hard-headedness, I think a profound belief in ourselves, and I say ourselves intentionally, not Chokwe as an individual. It should be noted that Chokwe actually did not want to run for office. We had to force him to actually take up that mantle. Now, once he accepted, he embraced it wholeheartedly. He took up the challenge, as a disciplined revolutionary, following, the wills and the interests of the organization, and that kind of pushed him into doing that. But there was a foundation that was laid, going back to when the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa first entered into Mississippi in 1970 and 1971, of which Chokwe was then a young, aspiring law student when he first went down. And that work just persisted for well over 30 plus years through his efforts and the efforts of many to really kind of take what was overwhelmingly a minority position, a minority idea, and to build, a broad, very open, very democratic vision around the liberation of African people first and foremost, but also a broader inclusionary program. But I think the thing, Juan, that has to be stated is that one of the things that made that victory possible was, in fact, the racism, the visceral nature of the racism that we confronted, and being able to present a clear alternative to that was democratic and inclusive. And that brings us to the Jackson Kush plan. And so that is fundamentally a base building strategy that was developed out of a think tank within the New African People's Organization and the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, which many of you here in New York may know of or heard of. And we sat down over a course of years, first after September 11th and then after Katrina, of just really doing a summary of where we were at, not just as an organization, but as a movement, and tried to make an assessment of where we could have the most impact. After several attempts of trying to make that someplace else, it kept coming back to Jackson, Mississippi. And we really tried to base it on the strength that already existed there. One of the concrete forms of that was the People's Assembly, which was already in motion at that time. And from that, we tried to look at other historic things that we knew that were needed. And one was Black and working class people having some ability to control the economy, control the means of production. And that is where the solidarity economy component of which Cooperation Jackson was basically born to help catalyze. And then there's the independent electoral politics, and that is where Chokwe Lumumba and the campaign enters into a kind of coherent strategy. And that is what we're still trying to work on, trying to figure out, trying to actualize.
And how were you able to, because gradually, within a short period of time, he was able to win over a lot of his former opponents and in the white community as well. What made that possible?
Well, I'm not quite sure. I wouldn't say that actually, that we won them over. Which I think is part of some of the things that we're struggling with right now with his son. For those of you who don't know, Chokwe Antar is our current mayor. And he is running up into a number of forms of opposition, and our overall project is running up into a number of forms of opposition, which I think question that. But I think in Chokwe's short lifetime, the biggest fear coming from his history and the history of the Republic of New Africa was that it was actually going to be something that was going to demand that all the white people in Mississippi leave. And it was like, no, we're here, you're here, neither one of us is going anywhere. Let's figure some things out and let's do it in an equitable and open manner, which has not been practiced despite your claims of democracy. We're going to actually try to open up the institutions and the dialogue and the questions so that there is more of a popular engagement around democracy. And a genuine, honest approach of that just in a short period of time, that did win over a lot of people. It eased a lot of fears, and it changed some of the political dynamics. But it doesn't mean that the contrary and varying and contrasting interests have changed. So, winning people over to an approach to engaging in politics, I think we gained some ground there. But certain folks still wanting to perpetually and perhaps, in their view, forever control the economy, that hasn't changed.
I wanted to ask Councilwoman Carolina Rivera, you were elected in 2017. 4 years earlier, perhaps the most radical group of elected officials in the history of New York City, and not just with the mayor of the city, the new mayor, but also in the city council and public advocate's office have gained power. But then, as often happens, divisions and differences, even within the progressive community, begin to show themselves. And you then come into office in what would be, I guess, the progressive government 2.0 in New York City now, as we're in this next 4-year stay. I wondered how you see the role of progressives in the city council of New York now. And as the honeymoon has long ended in terms of Bill de Blasio as mayor, but yet there are still battles to be fought.
Yeah, I'm lucky. I represent this area of New York City that is, you mentioned neighborhoods earlier, Lower East Side, East Village, historically very radical, revolutionary, very left, very civically engaged white and Latino community, specifically Puerto Rican community, and that's why I'm from there. My family's from Puerto Rico. And I think when it comes to progressives, people know my district as being a very, very progressive district. Just people who came together during their urban homesteading movement and cleaning out these vacant lots of rubble and creating community gardens and pouring sweat equity into these buildings. So people have this concept, this perception that my district is very progressive. And I think for myself and my predecessor and her predecessor, that's been historically accurate. I think going forward, we did have a mayor that's very, very progressive. And it's funny, when I was running for office, he endorsed my candidacy, and I thought, okay, this is an interesting opportunity. People said don't use it. It's like it's going to be toxic. And actually, when I brought him out into Tompkins Square Park, which has its own amazing history, people love to see him. They love to talk about universal pre-K and the right to counsel and some of these amazing ideas, many of which were overdue and some of which we took from other progressive cities in the world, but that were really important to people. So I think for us, what we're doing as a council, of course we assert our independence of the mayor. That's what we're supposed to do. It's supposed to be a checks and balances type of situation. But we're also trying to push, especially this progressive bloc, and I'm a part of the Progressive Caucus, we're trying to push other candidates in New York, specifically also in New York State, to the left. We have a very, very interesting governor's race this year. And I think that our role as progressives is going to be to continue to push specifically some of our elected officials, our colleagues in Albany. When it comes to the mayor, we're going to see what his future is going to hold. I know there are rumors as to what's next. But I think he's going to try to build and leave a legacy, this Tale of Two Cities legacy behind, in which he's really trying to invest in some of these communities that have been historically underserved. And I could talk about the 10,000 units of public housing that are on the waterfront in my community that has not seen money in decades. NYCHA, New York City Public Housing, has not seen money in decades. But I also know that my district is actually a tale of two cities. I have Gramercy Park with incredible wealth. And so I know that the rezonings, which he considers very progressive and is actually a big idea in New York City, is to invest in some of these underserved communities. So we're talking Bed-Stuy, Brownsville, East New York, places in the Bronx. And I think that is going to be the legacy that he's going to leave behind. So we're going to continue to push people to the left. I think you're going to see when it comes to something like safe consumption sites and drug use and decriminalization of certain drugs. And it'll be interesting to watch. I know we have a very energetic body. I think what's really going to be interesting is in 2021, I think it's maybe 11 of us that are going to stay behind. You're going to see this mass exodus because of term limits. So that is really going to shake the city up. And the other thing I'll mention is that, as a woman in the city council, I'm only one of 11 in a 51-member body. So we really are trying to carry a lot of water and push a lot of progressive issues that are very, very important to women.
I'd like to ask Deputy Mayor Pisarello, we were on a panel a little more than a year ago, and this was after Choco Lumumba had died, and his son was running for office, and it wasn't clear how things were going to turn out. And you suddenly said to me, "Oh yeah, Choco Antar is going to win." Because we've been meeting and we've been talking that his folks have been out to Barcelona and you had been exchanging notes and exchanging viewpoints. And I was not aware that there were all of these connections that were developing at the international level in terms of radical and progressive cities. So I'm wondering if you could talk about not only what were some of the main lessons that you've learned from the amazing municipal movement that's developed in Spain, and especially in Barcelona, but how these links began to be established.
Well, I remember we didn't just exchange ideas, but we also exchanged shirts, because today he's wearing a fantastic shirt, and the shirt is the platform. So, Rebel Cities Alliances start from shirts. And so actually this shirt belongs to the platform of mortgage victims, let's say. And so the current mayor of Barcelona, Ada Colau, she was the spokeswoman of this movement, and she led a movement of resistance to home foreclosures in Spain, and that's how we came to office in 2015. But in the Spanish case, that has a very important previous event. That was the 15th of May movement. That was equivalent to Occupy Wall Street here in America. But before that, we had all these grassroots social movements defending the right to housing. And most of the members of the current government come from this movement. We were activists. I was a scholar, but I was very in touch with this movement. And so we're the result of the financial and political crisis, and we are a response to this financial and political crisis, not just in Barcelona, because we won in Barcelona, but many Spanish cities like Madrid, Cádiz, important cities in Spain, were also won by these new citizen platforms, or by these new confluences between traditional leftist parties and new citizen movements. And that has been a very interesting experiment. After 3 years, we have survived. We are still alive. We haven't debased ourselves. We haven't enriched. We haven't we have proved that it's possible to have alternative politics, that not everyone is the same, that not everyone is condemned to be co-opted when you come into the offices, although it's very complicated. And one of the key elements of that, I think, has to do with these alliances. We have found out that we cities are too small to fight some battles alone, so that we need to coordinate ourselves and we need to fight together. And that's something very important that we have learned in these 3 years. When you have to deal with big multinational companies like Uber or like Airbnb, you can just not challenge all these corporations alone. But if you have cities alliances, you can negotiate in much better conditions. And that's very important, because most of the times we don't have the state with us, but we have the state against us. That's our case. We don't have a Donald Trump, but we have Mariano Rajoy, that if I send it to you, you will notice the difference. And so it's very important to coordinate and to have these cities alliances. And I think that now that we are also commemorating the 200th anniversary of Karl Marx's birth, I think that we could say that right now this motto, "Rebel cities of the world unite," is very important.
And the origins of the connection between Jackson and Barcelona, how did that happen?
Well, in my case, I was there one day, because the machine is horrible. I mean, you don't have time to think, you don't have time to, and suddenly, like a sort of miracle, they showed up there. They told me there's someone from Mississippi. And when they said that the last name of the candidate to the seat was Lumumba, that shocked me. That was very impressive, because I am from Argentina, and my father was a very modest lawyer, and he was kidnapped and killed by the dictatorship in Argentina in the 70s. But before that, he had been in Tanzania for a while, and he was very interested in all the African revolutionary movements of the 70s and of the 60s. So when I heard that we had people and the last name Lumumba showed up there, it was very, very, very impressive. And we had a wonderful conversation. They were very optimistic. It was something very important for us, because every time that a new citizen platform, that a new progressive candidacy emerged in the world, that strengthened our project in Barcelona. And every time that a municipal or a progressive experience is defeated, that weakens us also.
Well, I want to ask Margaret Mayor, this term progressive has gotten to be pretty elastic these days. There's all kinds of people claiming to be progressive. I understand the main politician speaking at the Smart Cities Conference is Rahm Emanuel, who in his own way is himself progressive. And I'm not sure if lots of other people feel the same way. Your book, Urban Uprisings, Challenging Neoliberal Urbanism in Europe, could you talk about this issue of separating who's for real and who's not in this issue of building a progressive urban movement? I'm thinking, someone just mentioned Uber. Well, Melissa Mark-Viverito in the city council was all for Uber, what Mayor de Blasio was trying to limit it. Yet they were both sort of progressives within the city government. I think of charter schools and versus public schools. And there are a number of areas where the so-called progressives have major divisions about the way forward. I'm wondering if you could talk about how the neoliberalism attempts to co-opt progressive governance.
That's certainly an evening-filling program question. And you managed to pack all sorts of important context into the question. So where to start? I'll try to tie it to our question here, the new municipalism movement. some call it, which manifests not just in Barcelona, but and not only in the form of miracles, as when Lumumba shows up in Barcelona, but through the actual work of networking, such as at conferences. One was held last year in Barcelona, where more than 100 or more than 200 even representatives of progressive, quote unquote, municipal stakeholders, let's call them, showed up to build those alliances. Now, to what extent are they all progressive? I mean, we do have now solidarity city initiatives, sanctuary city networks, and even the European Commission has a program where they fund and support cities to improve in terms of their anti-discrimination and diversity politics. All of that is progressive, but it depends. Even Rahm Emanuel, with his anti-Trump, partially sanctuary policies, can be viewed as definitely progressive and helpful for the progressive cause. But if I stick to that example, it is not enough, at least not in the sense of societal transformation that the people sitting on this podium envision, to speak of and encourage a discourse of diversity without actually touching the material bases of vulnerable populations, those that find themselves excluded. For that, we need some real serious redistribution from the top to the bottom, which is not always talked about. And we need some serious resources, because it costs. All of these issues that today manifest in cities, which is one of the essential conditions for why cities today are such important, many may say even strategic sites for addressing the problems that threaten the planet, whether it's environmental, poverty, inequality. All of those issues hit the ground in cities. That's where they need to be addressed and resolved. That's where integration happens, and so on and so forth. But cities, even though more and more important tasks are falling in their lap, increasingly lack the resources to do an adequate job. To prepare for another Superstorm Sandy takes serious resources. Individual cities can't handle that. We already heard that
or Hurricane Maria, as happened in Puerto Rico. Right?
Exactly, yeah, I just used the metaphor. I mean, and I'm not even mentioning Bangladesh or other countries where the fallout of such natural catastrophes demand even higher costs. Also, the control or more regulation of these globally active firms such as Airbnb will only be possible if individual cities enhance their strength through building powerful coalitions. So in that sense,
Okay, let me ask about another issue, which is many of these local governments arose out of social movements, and they come to power, but then some of the followers who helped get them elected become dissatisfied with some of the regulations and the laws they implement, or they don't think they go far enough. How do you, and you can all speak to this, how do you deal with this issue of expectations of the very movement that brought you to power, and now you are faced with the limitations of functioning within a capitalist environment, and there are compromises or changes that you have to make, and yet the base is not satisfied, or portions of the base are not satisfied? I'm wondering if any of you want to talk to this, particularly how you deal with it.
Can I just use it to finish my thought
Oh, sure.
process?
Absolutely.
Because that was exactly where I was trying to head to go. This gap between the diminishing resources of cities, while at the same time the expectations towards them from all sides, not just from urban and other social movements, that gap is becoming bigger, and it creates tensions then within this new municipalist movement that has emerged in the last, ever since the financial crisis really, but more intensely in the last few years in Spain, Italy, some German cities, and various other countries. So the radical movements keep making these demands at their governments, but even the most progressive, radical, activist-based municipal representatives are hemmed in at all sides by the federal governance structures, by corporate, private, financial institutions on whom they depend, as long as they believe economic growth is a foundation, a precondition for their politics, by competing political parties, even other leftist parties, definitely by social democratic parties, as we see in Berlin very clearly, where we have a red-green coalition government. Many people think it's a progressive government. The radical movements do not think so. And I hear also about Barcelona, that such tensions are coming to the surface. And this is one of the big questions that we all want to know more about, how the experiments that we have now with such progressives in local power, how do they actually manage to process them?
Anyone else want to tackle that?
There you go. Because I'm in a different position than you are. So. Well, I mean, I'm not in government this go around. And that was intentional and strategic. I mean, part of our collective assessment when Chokwe went into the mayor's office in 2013, we kind of quickly realized that there were a few too many of us in office and not enough street heat. That we had absorbed a lot of the critical leadership from the social movement into the administration, and we assessed that to be an error that we needed to correct the next go around. I'm definitely on the outside now, trying to remind everyone, at least in our context, of the box that we are in. And to try to provide as much leverage for the government to go beyond that box. That is the way I think the social movements, the way in which we should operate relative to, our comrades that we put in office. And sometimes, the comrades don't like it, but that is our role, which is to break those bonds, go beyond those constraints, hold folks accountable. But that's easier said than done, because a lot of times we don't necessarily the nature in which how it works, and I can say this from being both inside and outside, the nature in which it works, the nature of governance. The social movements oftentimes can't see the acts of the deliberation that go into playing the chessboard from the inside. I have to move this in order to move that. And moving this means that takes some time and may have to, balance it out by not paying as much attention on this as opposed to moving this to be more strategic. But there's so much need from the base for immediate relief that sometimes the strategic gets lost, I think, on the social movement side. And I think it's the question of how do we develop the political sophistication and maturity on both ends to know when to push, when to back off, when to advance, when to retreat. And each context, I think, is different. But that's where I think we should be headed. But I think this notion that somehow the social movements should be more tolerant or compliant or not as agitational against their own comrades, I think is an error. I think we need to be as pushing them as hard as possible because it actually creates more strategic room for the progressive governments to actually operate within rather than them having to constantly deal with the pull of the right, which is far stronger than us, both politically and economically.
Well, in our case, I think that we took the city's business leaders by surprise, the elites of the cities by surprise, because we had no link with financial powers, with big media, and I think that we won't be able to do it when we have elections next year. You can surprise them just once, and then they get to know you. When we came into office, they didn't have our phone numbers, they didn't know who we were, what kind of parties we, and so that was an advantage in a certain way that protected us, but it made us vulnerable also, because they thought that the city would be a chaos, that we would, that would be terrible. But we rapidly understood what we thought when we were outside the institution, which is that in order to achieve important social transformations, you need to have 1 foot within the institution and 1,000 feet outside the institution. Unfortunately, when you have a political responsibility, you cannot do both things at the same time. And so, if you're deputy mayor, you're no longer an activist. You don't forget that you were an activist. And when we came into office, we posted in our doors a note that said, "Don't forget who we are, where we come from, and why are we here." And 3 years after we came into office, we still have those notes there. But of course, we are not activists anymore. And so we try to have a very strong relationship with social movements, but respecting their autonomy. I think that's very important, respecting their autonomy. And that's very important in Barcelona, because Barcelona has a sort of anarchist tradition, and that's something very beautiful of the city, because it has very strong social movements, and these social movements want to be autonomous. And I think that our role as an institution is try to go with them, to accompany them, not trying to instrumentalize these movements in order to support the government. And sometimes you can do it, and sometimes you cannot. Sometimes these movements want to confront with you, and sometimes they let you be there if you still have the authority to do it, which is very important for us. When you have some demonstration in the street, and you go there, the first question is, how will people react? Will they still receive us as their comrades or not? And for instance, it was very important for us because in Barcelona we have the first female mayor in the history of the city, but just not a female mayor, but the first female mayor from very modest social origins. And we have the first feminist government in the city's history. We have more women than men as councillors, and that's very important. So when we had the 8th of March, those very impressive demonstrations in Spain and in many countries and in many cities all over the world, our government had the authority to be in the front line. And that was very interesting, side by side with these movements. But as I said, I mean, I think that you have to be aware that you need an inside-outside strategy. It's not easy to concrete it because you have different situations and different moments. And it's also very difficult to explain the obstacles and the difficulties because we don't have medias. We don't have our own medias. Sometimes you're walking in the street and people stop you and say, "But why aren't you doing this?" No, we are doing it. But you have to explain it. We don't know you're doing that. Or we don't know, for instance, the housing prices in Barcelona are increasing dramatically. And sometimes people stop us in the street and say, "Well, you should have rental control." And I say, "Well, but it's not our competence, it's the central government competences." And so we need to explain ourselves. And one of the problems we have is how do you explain yourself when you have the media controlled by very few interest groups. And we have tried to solve that with direct participation, with public meetings, but that's something we have to think better, I think. It's a very big challenge.
And Carlina Rivera, in the city council, the progressives have tried to press the concept of participatory budgeting as a way for the community to hold the council and the mayor accountable. But some would argue, and I think many would argue, that the participatory budgeting process is over a very tiny portion of the budget, and is almost more symbolic than it is real. And I'm wondering, how do you keep yourselves accountable in some kind of a systematic way to the voters, other than when they elect you every 4 years?
So first, let me say, when it comes to running for office, going back to your last question, I struggled with running for office because as a community organizer and somebody that comes from that background, I thought, well, is this the best position for me to be inside government? I kind of struggle with this idea that maybe it was me selling out a bit. But it took me back to the community board, and this will go to your participatory budgeting question, is that I joined my community board when I was probably in my mid to late 20s because I was working on a campaign, and not a political campaign. As a community organizer, your campaigns are around housing and environment and sanitation, which dealt with the negative effects of urban renewal. So here we're working on this campaign, and I have one of my colleagues here that worked on that campaign for many years, Tito Delgado. And we're at the community board, and I see the people that are gonna vote on some very important community guidelines, and I see no one that looks like me. There's no young person, there's actually one Puerto Rican guy. And so I decided to join my community board for that reason, is to see a reflection of myself. So the reason why I ran for office was because people said, you should run. You should run because we need you inside. We need the 1 foot inside, and then we will be your mass, your army outside. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to participatory budgeting, we have very, very super engaged community boards on the east side. I mentioned before how active we are. So there's 4 community boards that overlap my district, and my predecessor, Rosie Mendez, did not do participatory budgeting. And she said that was because we had very, very active community boards that would be able to work with me on capital, which is investment in infrastructure, and then expense, which is investment in programmatic initiatives. And I like the idea. So if each council member gets $5 million to put into infrastructure projects, and another approximately $750,000 to pour into programs, you probably give about $1 million in PB, and anyone can vote, and they actually brought down the age down to 12 years old. And I thought, how interesting is that regardless of your status, whether you're undocumented, you're an immigrant, you're an American citizen, you're 12 years old to however old you are, you can vote on how this money is spent. And while it might seem symbolic, considering that right now I think we're positioned to pass a budget of about $89 billion, what is $1 million? The reason why I'm gonna do it, and the reason why I'm bringing it to my district, is because it's the whole, trying to get people engaged to just vote. We're 46 overall in the country in voter turnout as a state. And for me, being 34, considered, I guess, a millennial, we don't vote either. And so I remember when I was running, people would say, Howard, your age group doesn't vote. You really have to focus on people over 55. So yes, I went in each and every one of those senior centers multiple times. But if I didn't think about my own, I would be disenfranchising my own generation if I didn't think of how to reach out to them. So I think PB is something that is universally attractive. You can vote online, we can set up all over the waterfront, and I mentioned the 10,000 units of public housing, and we were underwater during Superstorm Sandy, and there's so many needs in that district that I think it's a good tool. Is it exhausting? Does it take capacity? Yes, absolutely. But I think it's worth it, even if you can make one connection, if you could get one more voter to the booth, just to show that collectively we have power.
I wanted to raise another issue. Anti-immigrant xenophobia is sweeping the advanced capitalist world. Every major country, France, Germany, England, the United States, Poland, there are anti-immigrant movements developing, and some of them getting some bases within sections of the working class. I'm wondering, Margaret, how you think the progressive movement in Europe is dealing with this xenophobia in terms of another way to divide the popular movement over the issue of immigration? And what's the best way to move forward?
I'm glad you're asking this question. It's one of the most important today. And it's also important in my mind to raise in the context of our discussion about the new municipalist movement. Sometimes this conversation pretends as if, and it's true, there is an upsurge of progressive local platforms that have gained power across Europe, in part as a reaction to this rise in xenophobic and racist movements and political parties. But contrary to all that talk about cities since ancient times being the cradle of democracy and what have you, local municipalities also experience being captured by right-wing parties. I have not seen any quantitative studies how many Jackson, Mississippi's there are versus cities that are run by very conservative or right-wing parties. I know we have quite a few, especially in the eastern part of Germany, and we don't subsume them under the new municipalist movement, obviously. We are only interested in the progressive ones. But that's far from automatic. So part of the issues on the agenda of these progressive politicians and movements is obviously to address the division, this increasing gap within the population, like in Germany, maybe here also, it's sort of like a society split in two. Half tend to be more, to respond to all the immense transformations and restructuring in society by withdrawing inward, closing boundaries, and blaming responsibility for why they are feeling more insecure on some outsider. And the other half, the good civil society, if you like, mobilizing themselves into welcome initiatives and becoming active in support and in defense of refugees and pushing for both local and national and international politics of open borders and immigration-friendly politics and so on. What is particularly striking in a place like Germany is how many working class and union people, including former guest workers, i.e. Turkish or what have you, migrant workers, are now voting for the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, which is a right-wing party, as a way to resolve their problems, or the way they perceive their problems might be resolved. And rather than writing all these deindustrialized themselves threatened people, they are not only fearing that they are falling through the cracks, they are actually being thrown under the bus. Rather than writing them off, we, the left, has to develop more imaginative solutions, ways to have conversations that address all of those groups' needs and worries, including about security as well. Because splitting societies into two leads to some form of civil war, and this big danger is there anyways. Our societies are all more and more fragmented. Social media are doing their part. Everybody is within talking and relating only within their own world, which is a huge threat to the functioning of democracy.
I wonder if anyone else wants to tackle that one, especially because clearly here in the United States, I mean, even in a place like Texas, you have the state legislature passing legislation that threatening to lock up any mayor or sheriff or public official who refuses to cooperate with immigration, with ICE in terms of a detainer of an undocumented immigrant. So the police chiefs and the mayors of all of the major cities of Texas, which no one can call Texas a liberal state, are all opposed to this law, but yet the states' governments are increasingly preempting the ability of the local cities to develop their own more enlightened policies. And I wonder how you see tackling that and diminishing this division rather than exacerbating it.
The first thing I would say is that, I mean, our leadership, when you look at the mayor, when it comes to New York, I'm going to speak to New York specifically, that the NYPD should not be acting as ICE. And ICE as an entity is just very, very problematic. And I think that for us, and when we call ourselves a sanctuary city, what we really have to be careful about is, where is ICE? I'm the chair of hospitals, and one of the major concerns I get in a public health system is that people who are afraid to go to the hospital, or afraid even to go to school, are afraid that, or a court date, they're afraid ICE is going to be there to pick them up and take them away. And I think that we as a city have to be very, very careful, and we have to stand up for our immigrant population. And being Puerto Rican, being an American citizen, I think even when you see the political climate from Washington and how people from Puerto Rico are treated as second-class citizens currently, it really is disheartening. But New York, being this very, very progressive city, and we like to say that we're the most progressive in the world, but I know we're second, third, and eighth in some of the most important things, even like marriage equality. We have to really just make an example of what we're not going to give over. We're not going to give ID/NYC information over to the federal government. We are not going to have NYPD act as ICE. And then we also have to be very specific on how NYPD even operates and how they treat immigrants and families, and why are they in our schools. So it gets to be this very kind of big issue. But when it comes to immigrant communities, I think making sure that they have defense, making sure that they do get due process is going to be important. And we're working really, really hard here in New York to make sure that we're an example of that.
I mean, and we have a slightly different dynamic in Mississippi, in that we don't have a large migrant or immigrant population. The folks primarily on the move tend to go to Georgia or North Carolina at this point, or to Florida. The economy, as it is in Mississippi, just doesn't bear out that much in terms of jobs in agricultural fields or other things. So we have a very small population, but that's granted. Immigrants are a political, immigration, I should say, is a political tool in the hands of the right. and it is used, I think, very effectively, even in our context. And this administration, I think we're not doing enough to communicate. This administration, I mean the Trump administration, we're not doing enough, at least from what I can see and hear, we're not doing enough sharing amongst the different municipalities in the United States on strategies on how to deal with the kind of just wanton aggression that this administration is actually perpetrating on the municipalities. And just to give folks an example, so shortly after, literally within about a week after Chokwe won the Democratic primary, and historically in Jackson, if you win the Democratic primary, you won the election. Right? It's pretty much over at that point. So he won outright, which is, only happened one other time. So it was very clear where we were going. And within a week of that victory, there were several ICE raids in Jackson. And there were this kind of public staging ground that was going on for about like 2 months. And, most of the progressive forces, we were like, this is a message that's being sent because there's nobody here to even justify this expense. So this is a clear political message that's being sent from the federal government that is about limiting what they see as both the possibilities and the potentialities of what this project could become and where it's going. And then you have to deal with, this is the inside-outside piece coming back. So then, fast forward about 5 months later, there's an announcement for that the federal government representative from the Department of Justice, I'm forgetting his name right now, but he comes out in front of the federal building in Jackson, Mississippi. He makes this announcement that there's this launch of what's called Project Eject, from Jackson. And the city police chief is there. And it's this federal program which is basically saying, we're going to choose who to arrest and what to charge them for, and use some new laws, really old laws, but some new laws brought back, kind of reinactivated to charge people with federal crimes and to remove them from Mississippi, right? To store them or house them or to contain them outside of Mississippi, which, for us, there's a particular dynamic wherein we are trying to preserve the demographic character of Jackson, Mississippi, because it's kind of the bedrock of our program primarily. And the other side is very deliberately trying to change that demographic. So this kind of fits that narrative, but we can get poor black working class people out in vast numbers. It changes the political equation. So independent of Mayor Lumumba, the police chief is there. He makes his glaring announcement that he supports this program. And then Chokwe kind of skillfully fires him, i.e. in the form of a retirement, that makes some of the base mad because it's not particularly clear and it's part of the game. But what it brings up is more importantly, is again one of these constrictions, so that even where in our politics, some years ago, we initiated and got approved a human rights, I forget what exactly it is, but we got a human rights measure that got passed, which basically made Jackson a sanctuary city. And so it's been under threat from Trump and the Department of Justice ever since. They sent several letters, either you comply or we're going to pull money, and so there's this whole game that's being played. But even on the local level, how much control do we actually have over the police and some of these institutions, which theoretically are under the control of the mayor, but they have a lot of latitude to act independently by way of federal funding, by way of federal intervention, by way of federal collaboration that we are right now very, actively confronting in Jackson, which is not just about the question of immigration, but it's also a question about, can we define who belongs in our political projects overall, regardless of the question of citizenship. And the main thing I think that I want to end on is there's another concern that we have to be, I think, deeply challenged. is that the anti-immigrant rhetoric, even despite all these kind of progressive things we put forward, it is gaining a foothold in the Black community in Jackson around economic questions, even though there's no direct kind of competition. But there are a lot of folks who resonate with Trump's message that, hey, putting that border up protects, my job, it protects my economic status. It keeps a certain level of competition away from me. And we have to, I think, come up with some real clear, decisive messages that get at the root of the problem, which is, capitalism, and not, a labor problem or competition between different communities, all striving, for the basics.
Okay, I want to get to the elephant in the room, and then I'm going to try to throw it up to the audience of questions that you may have. Most of the major cities in the United States and in Europe continue to grow in population. They continue to become more diverse racially and economically. But I think back to as far back as 1968, one of the commissions President Johnson established was the Johnson Commission. It was a commission to look at the crisis in America's cities, a housing crisis. Now, back in 1968, the Johnson Commission said that the private sector left to its own will never build low-cost housing. This was a presidential commission. That only federal intervention could assure ending what was then a housing crisis in America in 1968, and that there was not sufficient numbers of low-cost housing to house the people in the cities then. Today, the cities are exploding in population. No low-cost housing has been built. How do you, as local officials, deal with the fact, where are the people going to live? Especially those who are low income and lower stratas of the working class in these cities in the future. And what is the pressure on you to cut deals with the private sector, to sacrifice height for crumbs of affordability in your zoning rules and laws? And this is true not just in the United States, it's true, you were mentioning in Barcelona, and I'm sure in Berlin and other places, in London and Paris and all these major cities. What do local progressive officials, how do they handle the housing crisis?
Well, it's a tremendous issue. Of course, in our case, because we came from housing rights movements, so people are the expectations are even more in our case when it comes to housing. And unfortunately, well, the basic problem is that housing competencies are federal competencies or regional competencies in our case. They're not municipal competencies. But that doesn't matter. I mean, people want you to do something and to solve the problem and to show that you are trying your best. And that's good. I mean, but it's a very dramatic situation because at the same time, you see that every time that you want to improve the city in terms of opening a park or making, opening a civic center in neighborhood, there's a risk of gentrification. So what improves the city can worsen the situation at the same time, because people may be expelled from the city because of housing prices. And so, I mean, we are trying to be very imaginative, which is very difficult because to have rebel cities, you need to have rebel civil servants. And that's not in the genetics of civil servants. Civil servants do not want to innovate, because if you have a precedent, then you have to change, you have to, and that's too risky. And so you need these rebel civil servants, which is not easy, to have these imaginary alternatives to this crisis. But we had found some ways, to act. For instance, in the case of Barcelona, we have created a specific unit to prevent evictions. And we have stopped like more than 2,000 evictions in the city. Maybe it's not that much, but it has decreased in 22% the number of evictions in Barcelona. And that's one thing, just to stop it. And then at the same time, when we had empty houses, owned by banks, we have fined many banks because they didn't want to let the city council use these houses, just to have affordable housing. And so we have fined the banks in some cases, and at the same time, we are trying to build genuinely affordable housing. Because now that's also a very risky terms, because when we talk about affordable housing, what we are talking about? Affordable for whom? That's one issue. And so in Barcelona, we have social housing, which is just 1% of the whole public stock. And social housing is about 200 euros per month, which is $350, more or less. Yeah, 300 or so. But that's social housing, and that's just 1%. So we need now different kinds of social housing, and we are using all the legal tools we have in order to do that. We have multiplied by 4 the budget investment in social housing, but at the same time, the central government, the federal government, let's say, has reduced 37% their investment in social housing. So we are doing a dramatic effort as cities, and as I said before, sometimes it's very difficult to explain to our people when you have the competence, when you cannot, how you denounce it publicly, because we try to say, we are doing this, we are not doing that, but we are not doing this because the responsibility is over there. And when we have to confront with the private sector, we do it, but we don't do it with the small property owner, but we start with the banks, with the big banks. And I think that's something important, because people see that the banks have been responsible for the crisis, and so they understand when you go against the banks. It's much more difficult if you go against a small property that has his house vacant because he cannot rent it, and so in this case, the first option is always to offer aids, to offer in order to renew their house, to rehabilitate it. And so we condition these aids to have this house with social rental. So we have like different tools, and now we're coming from Montreal, and we want to do it also with the New York City Council. We want to have a common document, and we want to present this document for the right to the city and the right to housing in United Nations in July of this year. And this document have like 10 measures to fight gentrification, defending rental control, defending social housing. And that's what I think that this alliance between cities is so important. We have to put in the agenda this horizon of profound changes. Maybe we as city don't have the competencies, but we have to put it in the agenda. And we have to say that housing cannot be a commodity, cannot be a luxury only available for the few, but that it's a human right. And even if we don't have competencies, we have a lot to do in terms of political pedagogy.
And Carolina, on this question, clearly Mayor de Blasio embarked on an ambitious housing plan, but it came under a lot of fire from many neighborhood groups, specifically over this issue of his belief, unfortunately, of his deputy mayor, Alyssa Glenn, is that you trade height for private developers building some small share of affordability, and of course, the affordability, again, who? Affordability for whom? How do you as the council deal with this issue of housing in New York City?
So I agree. I think this is the biggest issue facing our city. And my background as a tenant organizer was in housing. So I worked at a storefront at an organization called Good Old Lower East Side, and people would walk in to the storefront with numerous issues: predatory landlords, non-payment, holdovers. Sometimes the the cases were valid, sometimes not, right? This was just speculation. The Lower East Side is pretty much the poster child for gentrification, at least in New York, if not the country. And so, right, you're dealing with these interesting forces, the people who come from Wall Street, who feel like, well, the way to really leverage opportunity is to make sure that we're including the big banks, or we're including the people with money, and we're giving away land, we're giving away city land for years and years at a time, and we're getting 20% affordable in quotes, housing, and 80% market rate. And 20%, it's not affordable, you're absolutely right. It should be called income targeted. And when you mention social housing, we have our version, which is public housing. And so you're kind of struggling because public housing is funded historically by the federal government, but they haven't invested in decades. So as a city, how are we stepping up? We have this interesting fight that's happening between the mayor and the governor, which is just a disservice to New Yorkers everywhere. And so what are we supposed to do? All right, so we pass the right to council to give you legal representation. We fund something for senior citizens and disabled tenants to get a subsidy if they're low income, to freeze their rent. We're funding groups that are doing tenant organizing, like Goals, like Cooper Square Committee, people who have established these models for housing preservation. And so when you're going up against, someone who thinks it should be one way, when you know that their credits are out there, when you know that there's financing available, and it doesn't have to be the most innovative idea. You could take something that worked a few decades ago, something like Mitchell-Lama Housing, which is a limited equity cooperative, a form of home ownership, in which you don't own the unit, you own shares, and come up with a 2.0 version, come up with a 21st century version of home ownership opportunity. It's not brain surgery. Though, we have brain surgeons that don't really know what housing is, running important departments. So for me, I'm on the land use committee, I'm on the zoning committee, and I'm on the housing and buildings committee, and I'm trying to pass legislation, use zoning to put high caps that are not going to make every single neighborhood look like Midtown, and just really try to figure out how am I bringing 100% affordable housing to the Lower East Side. And for me, I want quantitative results. And so I'm bringing in units. I know he had a quantitative goal. He actually upped it, which I thought was even more ambitious. And so that's what I'm going to do. I want to bring tangible results to my community. That's what they deserve.
Wait, I just want to add that we have been able to foster, to launch some interesting cooperative housing programs. And that's functioning in Barcelona. I mean, in 3 years, we have doubled the number of cooperatives in the city, which is very important. I don't say that it's just because we are in office. Maybe there are different elements that help in order to have that. But we have many initiatives of social and solidarity economy that have succeeded. We are doing a lot of that, and we are showing that there are different ways of producing and of consuming. Actually, here we have the commissioner of social economy with us. He comes from the squatter movement of Barcelona, and he's doing a fantastic job there. And I think that's very important also, because that represents in Barcelona around 10% of the GDP of the city. It's not that much, but it shows something important. It shows that there are alternatives, and that these kind of alternatives can grow if you water this seed can grow. And it's a different way of producing and consuming. And in housing, it's one of the alternatives we are working on.
And Margaret, do you have any thoughts on the housing question?
Too many to present here. I'm actually curious. I mean, I'm curious about New York City because it's. I think Berlin is bad. It is leading in the world right now for the fastest, largest jump in real estate and rent prices currently. But it's still, compared to New York City, Manhattan definitely, it's paradise. So why is something like Mitchell-Lama not happening today? Can you just explain that quickly before I talk about Berlin?
I think it's a political will. I think when it comes to what people want to invest in,
I don't see people discussing it when I talk with people who work in housing and financing, specifically people who understand the market. This is something that could be reproduced. I don't know why the political will isn't there when the ambitious goals have been set. I do intend to find out. I'm in month 5 of my tenure. And I'm looking forward to just working with people and trying to understand why can't we reproduce something that has worked. The financing is available, and I think the investment can be made. A lot of it, and just to, when you were talking about being a progressive, I think that when you talk about being a progressive, for me, how I define it is tackling goals of like systemic oppression and institutionalized racism. And the people that are in Mitchell, a lot of them are middle-class people, families of color who work their way up through a union job or through just hard work, and just to reproduce those opportunities for families that are struggling. Right now, the people that are struggling in New York City, they are people of color. I know across the country, the most common person who's on food stamps is actually a white American, but in New York City, that's not what the poorest New Yorkers look like.
So it seems to me the biggest obstacle for progressive, or actually any local government, be it exploding cities, demographically exploding cities, or be it shrinking cities, is real estate. And that has something to do, David Harvey taught us that very clearly, that nowadays the kind of profit that investors are looking for is no longer being made in the traditional production, manufacturing forms of surplus creation, but in some predatory and speculative forms. And housing markets have been discovered by financial capital as one of the most excellent ways of making that kind of profit. And that's where the investment-seeking capital is going around the world. You were earlier saying that the elephant in the room is because cities have more and more residents, but it's everywhere. It's even in the shrinking cities of East Germany. Private equity funds are today landlords. And these are the global enemies that individual city governments can just be played out against each other. So we have to think big about how to take on this kind of opponent that has very different goals than human needs, but profit. It all comes back to that wonderful book title, Cities for People, Not for Profit.
Okay, and on those words, I'm going to throw it out to the audience for your questions to the panel, and please let's keep it to a question, not a long statement. We'll be able to get a few more in that way. All right, so I'll depend on you all to choose the question is because, I can see people now, okay, the lights are okay, so starting right here, yes sir.
Yeah, my name is Tito Delgado, and I'm a long-time housing activist, 40, 50 years now. I've worked with Paulina on many issues. Community land trust. I think this gentleman here from Spain talked about cooperatives. We have to get speculation out of the housing system. We have a land trust, a community land trust on the Lower East Side that's been working. For 20 years it's been working. Our average rent is $4,500 a month in the East Village. And the reason it works is because the land trust controls the land and no one can speculate on it. So I guess people touched upon it, but if you check out the speculation from it, and the city has a lot of vacant land. I mean, it has tons of vacant land, fire stations that are closed down. It's there. We already passed a resolution in the city council to recognize community land trust. However, I don't think people are really on board on it yet because they don't understand it. But if anyone can speak to that, please.
Community land trust.
I mean, community land trust where I'm at is profoundly different than where you are at. You know, I often joke trying to recruit people from New York to move to Mississippi. That literally for the amount of money you all are paying for rent, I could buy several houses for 1 month rent where I'm at. But I mean, that's not going to last forever. Primarily to the reason that you're speaking to. So one of the strategic things that we've been trying to do off the bat, you know, Cooperation Jackson is only 4 years old, and one of the first things we did was take all the resources that we ourselves had saved, we could muster, things that folks had given us from donations, and use all of that virtually to acquire land. And to use it to acquire land, to put it into a community land trust, to essentially, or to the greatest extent possible, decommodify it. Because that's the only way we're going to be able to counter the major forces of capital coming in. I don't think that I would agree with you. I don't think enough people know about this tool. But I still don't think just setting these things up institutionally really are the long-term solution, actually. That there has to be political power which actually changes the overall system. And I see that, you know, as a stopgap measure in our case and everywhere. And that, I think, is the piece that we're really going to have to deal with in the short term and in the long term. And, you know, one of the things that I can say that the folks who aren't in office can say is, you know, in our community, we're encouraging folks to, while there's still some time and opportunity, to get back into some of our squatter roots and take back the land as a means of pressuring the system at a critical time of an ongoing crisis. I think we've been talking about the crisis of 2008 and 2007 as if it's over, when it actually is not. I would argue, and this is for subject for debate, that we're on the verge of another major housing bubble in the here and now anyway. But I don't see us getting politically prepared for that. And that starts with having a conversation about what to do when that comes. How we're going to situate ourselves as social movements and progressive governments to be able to do some forward thinking about how do we react when the bubble hits.
Okay, another question? Yes, right here.
Hi. So I'm interested to learn what your political decision-making process is when you have groups that want cooperative housing or believe that housing is a human right, but they're also pro-police, or they support some of the smaller legislations that do push people out of their homes. So how do you reconcile people with conflicting political points?
I don't know. Well, I don't know if I got the question, but in our case, I mean, the pressure over the city is tremendous. I mean, in the case of these international hedge funds that you were talking about right now, they come every day and they buy entire buildings in neighborhoods. They just expel the people, and so they get new people there. And they have the legal right to do it. So, I mean, how can we stop that? That's the issue. I mean, we have publicly declared these speculative funds enemies of the city. Because when they ask us if we are business friendly or not, we always say, what kind of business? Are we talking about like social and environmental responsible businesses? They are welcome to Barcelona. If they are just these speculative hedge funds, they're the enemies of the city. They are not welcome at all. And we'll do our best to prevent them from being in our city. So what we do? Well, sometimes we have a sort of preference right, and we can buy those buildings before they do it. But that costs money. But we have done it strategically in some neighborhoods and say that's municipal, so you won't be there. And that will be for social housing, that will be public housing. But that has a limit, of course. You cannot always do that. Sometimes, I mean, we have used our legal tools in order to be very strict, in order to control these hedge funds. So if they use renewal actions as an excuse to expel some of the people living, of the tenants living there, we find them. We stop their operations in the city. But of course, as I said before, if you want to tackle these issues, you have to have 1,000 feet out of the institution. So now, for instance, in Barcelona, we have a very strong but new tenants union. We didn't have tenants union before. We had it in the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. And now we have tenants unions again, in a different situation, because they do not work in the same place, they do not have the same job, so these working conditions have changed a lot. But so what they are doing is they are demonstrating in front of those buildings when people is going to be evicted, and sometimes our councillors go there and they demonstrate with the people. And so right now we have two councillors, two women, who have been sued by these real estate companies and by these hedge funds. So when you challenge them, they attack. And sometimes they use the judicial power because they know they have a legal framework that benefits them. And so you have to challenge this legal framework. But sometimes I think it's worth facing the conflict. It's worth facing the conflict because you will never have, you can never conquer the right to the city without conflict. And you have to accept that, and you have to be brave and you have to be courageous. Obviously, you cannot fight all the battles at the same time, but you have to choose some battles and you have to fight them. And I think the battle against these speculative funds is a central one.
Okay, other questions back there?
Can you take some from the back?
Sure.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to preface my question by saying that I, think all of you are doing tremendous work, and, especially those who are in the position of being in power. So please, take my question first with a compliment. But what I want to raise is the question of sort of radical municipalist politics. I want to follow up on what Kelly said about the political power, which really changes the system, has to be the ultimate goal. I lived in Burlington, Vermont for more than 20 years, and as everybody here knows, that's the home of Bernie Sanders. And Burlington, in fact, was one of the places that was a leader in land trusts. But if you go to Burlington right now, where there's a Democratic mayor now, but many progressives still on the city council, it's as if Bernie Sanders never existed, as if he were never mayor at all. And that's because when you put all your trust in politicians and you vote them in, no matter how progressive they are, often they're co-opted by the system. We saw that with the West German Green Party. Look at, the coalition they made. And Syriza, it's difficult. So what I guess I want to ask, my question is, following up again, Khalid mentioned capitalism. How do we go about creating a situation where it's not just about electing a progressive representative, but really re-empowering people at the neighborhood level, really re-empowering the base, doing what some people may be familiar with, is going on, for example, in Rojava in Syria, where every commune meets, the neighborhoods meet together. And so what I wanted to ask is, in terms of sort of trying to change the nature of politics, would you all support working towards citizens' assemblies that actually, instead of thinking about voting for a representative where you just go into a ballot box and press a button, think of the person who's voted in as a delegate, somebody who's really representing the view of the assembly, and what other kinds of sort of empowering initiatives might be presented that can really change, that can make people empowered and also recognize that we have a much bigger problem than just remedial efforts.
If any of you want to tackle that, a couple of you maybe, but if you can keep the remarks brief so we get some more questions in.
Sure. Not only with the home of Bernie Sanders, which he did very well in the East Village, as you can imagine, during the primary, but also some of the green initiatives that Vermont has put forward, which I would love to replicate, and I'm working on a very micro level on the Lower East Side. So whether it's microgrid technology or using our network of community gardens as bioswales to capture storm water and future disasters, really trying to look at other cities like that. So I'd be open to looking at whatever people feel is, I want to be reflective of how people feel in terms of their trust in government. I think even what just rocked us last night with our Attorney General in New York, people continue to lose trust, indictment after indictment. And that's really unfortunate, but I think when it comes to getting a body that is diverse, I'm not from a political family. Like my mother, 36 years working for the city, she's gonna get a pretty good pension. She works really hard and she raised 2 girls. And in New York City on not much. And I think that we need a body that is reflective of that diversity. So we need teachers and we need anthropologists and we need community organizers. And we need different kinds of people as elected officials and not just these political dynasties. So when it comes to getting people engaged, we have to try everything. That's why I'm trying participatory budgeting. That's why I'm taking as close to a community organizing model as I can into my council office, though knowing the activism hat is not as prominent. And it's tough because you're really just burdened with bureaucracy. And you try to explain that to your constituents, but it's difficult. But I think open assemblies and town halls, like that's the kind of council office that I'm gonna run. And I think that if you follow me on Twitter, you'll see that I'm really, really just trying to be there and visible and open and receptive.
You want to jump in?
Yeah, the only thing I just try to add is we got to be mindful of the politics, not just the form. We have a situation now in Jackson, which I don't think is necessarily a bad one in and of itself, where there are 5 different groups that are doing something that they're calling a people's assembly. Now, I think that is actually an advance, because to a certain extent it means a part or a portion of our position is gaining more strength. But the issue is that there's one of them which is very explicitly a right-wing group, which is also trying to appropriate the forum to move its politics forward. And I don't think we deny them that democratic right, but it doesn't, just assuming that we kind of are willing to open up more space, it still doesn't necessarily deal with the question of how do we contend with the continuing views and the continuing politics and the continuing interests that exist within the community. And that I think we have to figure out some far more ways than we've done in at least the recent past on how to deal with, and what I think the left, at least in the United States, is equipped to deal with right now.
Okay, let's see, back there, is there any hands up in the back? All the way in the back. All the way in the back, yes.
Thank you, and Juan, since you're such an excellent questioner, I give you permission to help me to, hone this question so it'll be, tight. Kali, I hope you'll put the website out into the people's minds right now, if you can, before I formulate this question better. Can you just say the website for your... cooperationjackson.org, that one? Yes, yeah. And if you want to say it later when you're going to be in Brooklyn, because this is a lot, maybe Manhattan audience, just because of the messed up train system. I want to bring healthcare as a organizing tool. We know that Chokwe Lumumba died in a hospital because he didn't get served for hours. So what about a worker cooperative of housing and health care workers? Why? Because you could have a land trust that actually had a hospital on the premises with progressive people doing the healthcare, so that people wouldn't die who are in this movement, because we're all going to have a body that needs to get help here at some time. So I really want to bring worker co-ops back into the conversation a little bit. And I think that'll be simple enough rather than go too wide, although I would like to say that Savant in Seattle is a socialist mayor. I just want to put that into the conversation.
Anyone want to deal with that?
And I hope Kali will talk a little bit about the worker co-ops in Jackson.
Yeah, on that medical one, that's a more private conversation. There's a group of us who are thinking about it, let's believe that. But the medical corridor complex in Jackson, which has been growing, has been on the books for over a decade now. That's the leading force of gentrification in the city. So we got to treat that very delicately, particularly as the money is starting to flow now because some political decisions have been made around some real estate moves. A large part of our, I would say, our deep strategy is trying to figure out how to deal with them and how to hold, we call this fortification line against their imposition coming further south into the community and displacing, more Black working class folks, because a lot of the area around that hospital, they've already bought it up. They bought it up about 10 years ago. Black people still live in those houses, but they don't own them. So there's some things that we're trying to figure out how to do. I think, just in brief, to allow some other folks to talk, I think worker co-ops are a part of the solution. They are not the solution in and of themselves. And I think we need to be clear on that. That's something that we've been trying to be mindful of. If they help us build towards and attain more of a base and more power, I think they're helpful. But sometimes we know those very institutions, in the same way, without a political ground, it can actually be forces of gentrification. So, politics at the center, politics at the command does not change regardless of the form that we implement.
Okay, I think I'm told we have time for one last question. Anyone? How about right here, sir? Yes, you.
I can shout.
Okay.
So one issue that didn't come up very, very clear, and I think it's definitory of progressive municipal government, is the issue of public services as public goods. So quality education, quality transportation, quality healthcare. So perhaps some reflection on how the progressive management of public services can help to bring the idea of how a progressive city can live.
I just want to say really quickly, when I think about access, I think about 4 basics, and I didn't make this up. This is something like the Young Lords put into practice and many other groups, social justice groups, but it's food, housing, education, and healthcare. Those are the 4 basics, and if I feel like my constituents cannot access those, then I'm not doing a public service good.
I will.
Go ahead.
No, I would say that we made a difference in those kind of issues. I mean, when we came into office, they told us that the Barcelona City Council was a sort of transatlantic ship, and it was very difficult to change its direction. And after 3 years, you realize that you have been able to change it, and because you have been able to change budget priorities. And when we say budget priorities, and that's very different from right-wing governments, and budget priorities are public services. When I say we have multiplied by 4 housing investment, we have opened more pre-kindergarten schools than ever. Healthcare system has received more investment, and that's real change, and people notice that. And I think that's a minimum program of a progressive municipal government. Obviously, you can do more, because sometimes it's not enough with like social democracy, but you need economical democracy. And that has to do with cooperatives, different ways of production, but in order to have these public services guaranteed, I think these progressive governments, almost all of them, make a clear difference.
And Margaret Conley.
I'm glad we are at least trying to end on a positive and optimistic note, and we all hold Barcelona now as a inspiring model that's worth following. But it is a very minority experiment at this point.
Many difficulties, many contradictions.
Some of which we even touched on a little bit. The sad truth, however, is there are not that many Barcelonas yet many cities wish they had the tensions and problems that Barcelona is encountering, but at least they are encountering. The reality on the ground with most cities today, however, is that they are facing more and bigger and hard to solve problems given given austerity of the last 40 years. They find themselves indebted and so cannot, even with good willing people in office, provide quality and affordable public goods and services. And so we find ourselves often in the situation that civil society organizations are trying to make up for this lag. And that has a lot to do with one of the questions that was raised here earlier. How do we get people empowered and engaged? Many people are actually engaged in trying to mend those holes and fraying welfare state and other social services. What should be and used to be task of the state, now people in their free time are trying to produce. So it's a very precarious balance between a kind of politicized engagement that we all need to get those 1,000 feet in the street that every progressive politician needs, and being wary of exploiting the energy and the spirits of those soldiers on the ground in just providing a level of affordable and good services and public goods and infrastructures that we need to survive. Southern European countries like Greece especially are showing us every day just how precarious and difficult and really threatening this situation can easily become. So empowering people politically can neither be mandated from above. Even a progressive government has limited tools at its hand to activate the people. It's only struggles around their own interests and knowledge that can get people excited and inspired to struggle and put pressure on whatever politicians are in power, whether they're progressive or conservative.
Okay, and on that note, I want to thank our panelists for their wonderful interventions and discussion. Gerardo Pizareto,